Thanks, Betty Jo, for joining me on Intentional Design, or should I say Dr. Boucher. You have had quite the decorated career in higher education. It's been almost 20 years now, and most of those roles have been leadership positions. You're active in the community, giving of your time to Quality Matters, where you have multiple certifications, the Online Learning Consortium, where you teach workshops and certificate programs, UPSEA, where we saw each other last, right before the pandemic, and you're a thought leader. You're thoughtful, and you're one of the most dynamic people I have ever had the pleasure of knowing. And when when we talked recently, you shared with me a little bit about your new role as Dean of Online Education at National Louis, which this is not a new leadership role for you, but it's been a new transition for you. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your new role, what the focus or priorities are for the coming school year, and maybe a little bit beyond that.
Thank you for the gracious introduction. I feel the same way about your energy and dynamic nature. So just wanted to lead with that. So yes, I started the position of Dean of Online Education a few months ago. It is a new role for the university. So I'm super excited to be the inaugural holder of this role and the institution. And what is really unique about it too is that I've sort of grown into this role over time at NLU and just kept tugging the thread, if you will, on how important online education is in our portfolio, and how true leadership around that, unified leadership around that, can really benefit our students, our faculty, and our staff. So it really has been my pleasure to sort of walk into this role. And as we think about what the role really means, part of that is taking shape. We have a long history of really high ownership in our programs with our chairs and our deans, and they've done an excellent job really, thinking about online education and launching programs in the online modality, and we have a lot of hybrid programming, low residency programming. So we already have a ton of strength in this area. And so I really view my role as sort of, kind of harnessing all that strength and that power to create kind of a unified direction for us all to run to, and thinking about how we then sort of risk-proof our organization going forward by saying, okay, we have all of this strength that helped us get through the pandemic. What are the new strengths we need to be building in this sort of ever online and hybridized, teaching and learning environment?
So you've got a lot of work on your plate, but National Louis did a really good job of having a lot of online programming pre-pandemic. I'm curious, as the pandemic hit, what were the shifts? What were the things that the online learning team had to do to help the faculty get across that hurdle? And maybe tell that story, but then also tell us about where you go from there and kind of how your leadership will help move people in that direction.
Sure. So again, it's a good news story for us because we had so much muscle built in online and hybridized teaching and learning that in many ways, despite sort of needing to, move students into that modality, a lot of our faculty, the majority of our faculty, already had strength in both types of teaching, whether it was in classroom or online. So really the lion's share of the work was adaptation of lessons and curricula and courses into sort of this remote and online environment, where we were also then heavily using web conferencing to simulate some of that in-class, experience that, would have normally happened for our students that really needed that campus-based, that meeting, with their peers and their faculty. So we spent a lot of time in the sort of adaptation, mode. Certainly, we had some faculty who wanted to strengthen their practice in online and remote teaching, and we spent a lot of time pulling together training and individually supporting our faculty to do that to the best of their ability. And despite it being, quite a lot of work for several of us, I will say that it didn't feel hard. It felt voluminous in some ways, right? Because there was just so much to do when everyone was, sort of shifting into that space. But it didn't feel maybe as hard as I heard, in stories of other peer institutions. I will also say that it was a really interesting closing of a gap between the services our on-campus students would receive in the past and the ones that our online students would have received. And so instead of there sort of being, in some cases, differences between those services, we were able to bring this real equity lever into the conversation where all of a sudden all of our student services were also virtualized, right? And so that was a really rapid shift for us, a really healthy one. And we're really excited to think about how we continue to honor the ability for students to consume services in the mode that they're most comfortable with or that's most convenient to them. So that's a lot of the work that we're doing right now as we head back into fall is how do we still accommodate? So for example, in our learning support team, how do we still accommodate a Zoom at 9 p.m., right? When we want to be thinking also about on-campus hours. And so there's a lot of, work being done around kind of creating these hybridized schedules for a lot of the folks that work in our, kind of student services area, all of the, the areas outside of academics as well. And so part of my role is really helping to think through that, right? And when we, start to really focus on the return back to campus, part of, what I think I bring to that conversation is a yes and. We're returning back to campus and we're learning how to sort of be this organization that really does meet students' needs in the way that they need, right? And the way that our faculty and staff need. So how do we build community both back on campus, but also continue to do that virtually? Even in small things like how do we facilitate a bimodal meeting, right? When we have folks on Zoom and some in person, how do we equitably engage both audiences? And whether that's a business meeting for us or whether that's, a synchronous or some type of hybrid, class meeting that we might be doing in the fall. So I'm always that person kind of raising their hand, thinking about, this area that's not bound to a physical location. That's a lot of what, I bring to those dialogues.
So you bring up some really important points because during this rapid shift to remote teaching, some of the stories that we've heard have been equity focused and concerns about the student support pieces. Many institutions were able to fill the gap with synchronous technologies and continue teaching, right? But can you give some concrete examples of some of the student supports that you were able to put into place in a virtual sense that you may even keep post-pandemic?
Sure. I mean, really, I would be hard pressed to say what service we weren't able to bring into a virtual space, during the pandemic. I just can't say enough about how flexible and creative our staff have been to say, now we need to, to do all of these things online. How do we do that very rapidly, right? So again, I would be hard pressed to sort of find, one or two things that maybe we didn't. And, that's the conversation now is, the good news is, for example, mental health services, right? We always had some services for our students in Illinois on campus. But now we see that, there have been some changes in how licensure sort of travels from state to state where we'll be able to continue to offer students, telemental health, but also to do that across state lines in many cases, right? So I think that's a really good example too of not only kind of the facility that higher ed had for some of these types of services, but how industry really responded to the need as well, right? Because we couldn't, continue services like that unless, the Bureau of Professional Licensures in these different states didn't sort of respond to the need for that to happen. So again, I don't see us, sort of scaling back those things at all. In fact, I see a real want and a need, and a goal of us figuring out how to now do both, right? And interestingly, I think this is it is kind of an interesting artifact of NLU culture, is that, we often really, our mission, our aim is really student centric, right? And so it would be sort of a miss for us to then say, oh, we're now going to scale all of these things back. We understand our students have now been sort of conditioned to having these services virtually. We understand the nature of a contemporary, college and university student who says, well, gee, I can just watch Netflix whenever I want. Why can't I just access my financial aid whenever I want? Right? Whether I'm on campus or on my phone, on the train, right? So I think we've always been sort of tuned into that, and then we proved out concept really quickly. And now our job is to really figure out how to accommodate both.
Fantastic. And I know you're also shifting a bit from a very course-centric focus to a more programmatic view of the offerings that'll be available to students, including some of the student services pieces. But can you speak to what that shift entails as you begin to think more programmatically?
It's a very related, it's very related territory, right? So, thinking holistically around this student experience, and prior to COVID-19, prior to all of this happening, we really invested significantly in instructional design and learning design, right? So we have a very extensive inventory of course templates that we have that then faculty sort of customize as they're teaching those courses. And because it was such a significant investment and we developed so many courses in such a short period of time, I think, sometimes our efficiency sort of overrode kind of thinking about the entire student experience in this program. And so, now that we really do have all of these new virtualized services available to us, now that we've been able to take our breath for a second, part of my role is to sort of, help our programs, kind of sift through what do we want students to think, do, and feel while they're in this program. And that might involve the experience within that online classroom. That might involve how they're onboarded into the institution, what their orientations look like, how we take them through financial aid, all of those different kinds of things. I don't lead all of those things, personally, but those are the things that I'm really thinking about, right? Is how do we think about this student life cycle approach for our online students that is really threaded together from the very beginning all the way into those courses that are really threaded together throughout their program, so that we're, then graduating out this whole student experience. And that includes a lot of push in from a career readiness perspective as well, right? So making sure that graduation really also says career attainment, right? That these things aren't actually, that they're not separate things. Our expectation is our students are going right out into the career that they've really come to change their lives for.
Yeah, and we had a really interesting dialogue recently about mapping against standards and competencies and kind of the hidden curriculum, if you will. Can you tell me a little bit about your vision and your forecast for what that looks like, not just maybe for National Louis, but for other institutions who are forward thinking in this way?
Yeah, I think what we've sort of moved to over time, I think, is certainly we understand, and of course, quality matters. And Oscar played a really important, role in us really understanding alignment, right? When we look at learning objectives and materials and assessments and activities, and we've really come to a state of maturity at NLU around this type of alignment and how you really design a learning experience. And now I think our next step is how do we then address all of the other things that we really need our students to learn while they're with us? Some of that comes from maybe their intended career and their licensure. Some of that comes from really just what we hold dear, in terms of our university learning outcomes as well. But, there are some critical questions here around, how do you build critical reasoning really intentionally in courses, right? As you're thinking about what are all of these things that we do to meet this one particular course learning objective, how do we also really, create these sort of citizenship, types of skills while they're with us. We know that employers, really place value here and place weight there, right? And so I think it's really then, saying, okay, we've got this idea around designing this discrete learning experience. How do we then take a step back and say, where are we going, from like a human perspective, in these programs? And I think that's the next generation for all of us. I don't think that NLU is particularly unique in this area in terms of kind of this time to sort of say, like, how do we get to the next level, right? Especially as we face, non higher ed competitors, for lack of better words, coming in to say, well, we're just going to address these one or two surgical things and get students, get folks out into the workplace much faster, right? So we have to think about, the value add beyond just, one particular or two particular industry specific skills.
Absolutely. And actually, the last person that I had on intentional design was Deb Adair from Quality Matters. And we were talking about how do we get these really robust experiences to unfold in online learning or blended learning. And she pointed out the role of the instructional designer, how important it is to collaborate with faculty and ideate. Can you speak to the process that you have there at NLU and the importance of the instructional designer in that process?
Sure. So we have a very intentional instructional design process. We were able to bring in some talent a couple of years ago that really sort of created a lot of structure and organization around that, so that we really are sending faculty through kind of this journey of putting this course together from a student learning perspective, as opposed to just a content perspective, right? And kind of thinking about the entire, experience as opposed to just one, discrete course. And for me, and this is not intended to diminish the role of instructional design, but in my opinion, to elevate its importance, is a great course that's been designed is the perfect platform for awesome online teaching, right? And so we have to be thinking about, yes, we want to design this wonderful learning experience with all of this alignment. And how does it enable our faculty to really bring their whole selves to this course and create all of this energy and excitement around the learning at the same time? So I think that, if we think about the important partnership around that, our learning designers are really tasked with, making sure the faculty are having time for that ideation, right? That they are kind of thinking through the experience, right? And kind of challenging them to think out of potentially our norms that we've built over time, right? So, we again, significant investment in course design over the past several years, and had developed, kind of a way of designing online courses, which is absolutely great, right? And we were able to build a lot of structure around that. And I think we also want to challenge, our notions as we go. Is it always an online discussion, forum that we have to put in here, right? What are the other ways that we can really, engage our students, throughout the week in those courses that aren't, the sort of standard, practice, right? What are the other creative things that we can be doing, like virtual reality and, all of these different kinds of simulations, and sending students out into the field as opposed to, also, always having simulated experiences as well. So for us, instructional designers, really learning designers, as we call them at NLU, are really this critical partner that is in this, sort of challenge our faculty while they're challenging the learning designers, to come up with this beautiful concert, of a course that fits within this beautiful songbook, of a program, if you will.
So, Betty Jo, you brought up a really important point about you bringing kind of the teaching and learning view of the world into the work that you do. And you have a student that has told a tale about you as a teacher that I think touches on three key elements that you mentioned. One is feedback as rigor. One is knowing that someone cares about you and your learning. And the last point is that it's about real world experiences and really getting a chance to understand the world that they would apply their learning in. And so that quote from your student says, "It was a pleasure to have Betty Jo as a professor at National Louis University. She was strong and passionate about the class she was teaching. She provided quality feedback and genuinely cares about the progress of her students. Her use of technology for instructing was informative and innovative. She delivered a taste of real world experience to her students." So I don't know if you've seen that one yet out there on the interwebs, but I think it's very clear that you bring that energy and that passion to everything that you do, including this conversation. So I just want to thank you so much for spending time with me today. It is always wonderful to chat with you, and I hope by sharing this with our community that others will benefit from your wisdom.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for reading that student comment. That's really what it's all about, right?
Thanks, Betty Jo.